This episode of Peppa Pig was never shown on TV and is a deleted episode of the animated series The Nightmare Dimension Night had settled over Peppa Pig's house, and everything seemed normal. The moon cast a soft glow through the window. George was quietly snoring in his little bed, and in the distance, the gentle creaking of the floorboards marked the steps of their parents. It was just another peaceful night, but when Peppa opened her eyes, everything was wrong. The room looked different. Instead of the familiar yellow wallpaper, the walls were dark and cracked. The window no longer showed green hills and a bright sun. Beyond it was only endless, thick fog, glowing faintly with an eerie red light. The air carried a strange scent, like the aftermath of rain, but mixed with something metallic. George had woken up too. His bed seemed taller and narrower, as if the walls had shifted. His toy dinosaur, which had been brand new yesterday, now looked old and covered in dust. The house was unrecognizable. The floorboards groaned too loudly, the hallway stretched longer than it should, and the paintings on the walls, paintings that had never been there before, depicted faceless figures. A heavy silence filled the air, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water, though there was no water in sight. Something moved in the kitchen. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed in the darkness. A tall shadow appeared in the doorway. Its outline was familiar, resembling Daddy Pig. But something was wrong. It didn't move like Daddy. Its eyes glowed with a cold, white light, and its breath sounded like a distant wind sweeping through an empty void. The walls whispered. The voices were faint, as if they came from the house itself. They called out, offering warmth, a cozy dinner, a place to stay. But there was something deeply unsettling in their tone. Through the fog outside, another shadow flickered. It moved in unnatural, jerky motions, like a broken puppet. Something was here, watching, waiting. Peppa gripped George's hand tightly and took a step back. The world around them was changing. The walls seemed to pulse as if they were alive, and the air grew heavier. They had to run. But where? And was there even a way out of this nightmare dimension?
Peppa Pig The Mask. It began on a cold, windy day, the kind of wind that pulled at trees and scattered wet leaves across the pavement. The sky had been gray for many days, the park was empty, and the paths were soggy. Peppa and George were walking along a muddy path. Leaves stuck to their boots, and the ground squelched beneath them. Then Peppa saw a white shape lying in the grass. A mask. It lay perfectly flat, as if placed there on purpose. Not fallen, not forgotten. Face up, white, smooth, featureless. Just two dark slits for eyes, and a thin line where a mouth should be, not a smile. Peppa stopped. She bent down, touched it with her hoof. The mask was dry, not cold, as if it had been waiting for her. She pressed it to her face. The mask stuck, silently, effortlessly. At first it seemed like a game, but the mask wouldn't come off. Her hooves slid along the surface, finding no edge, no straps, no seams, nothing. She tugged, pulled harder. It didn't move. The mask had become part of her face. When they returned home, no one reacted, or maybe no one wanted to. The family acted as though nothing had changed, too calm, too quiet. Peppa sat at the dinner table, but her voice sounded muffled, like it was coming through glass. No one looked directly at her. The next day, the mirror behaved oddly. When Peppa turned her head, the reflection lagged behind. When she raised her hoof, the motion was off, as if someone inside the mirror was trying to mimic her but not quite managing. By the third day, she could barely feel her face. The mask didn't press, didn't itch. It simply was, still, silent. She tried to remember her old appearance, but the image blurred, like looking through foggy water. Her toys felt unfamiliar. The room looked wrong. Even her favorite blanket smelled different. Her clothes didn't fit right. Everything rubbed, tugged, shifted. She no longer felt at home in her own home. Time passed strangely, day after day, but it meant nothing. The house grew quieter, as if it were absorbing sound. Mummy and Daddy rarely spoke. They were present but distant and fading. Peppa began to hear whispering, not from outside, from within. a whisper without breath, without tone, repeating again and again, "You are the mask, you are me, you were." On the fourth day, the photographs changed, faces faded, first George, then Daddy, then Peppa herself. The places where eyes and smiles used to be became pale, empty spots. Sometimes the mask itself changed, subtly, narrower, smoother, as if it was adjusting. Each time she looked in the mirror, she saw something unfamiliar, something staring back at her from the shadows, always silent. On the fifth day, the room had changed. No windows, walls blank like paper. The air was heavy, like she'd slept for too long. She woke up and didn't recognize anything. Nothing felt familiar, no toys, no books, no sound. In the middle of the floor lay the mask, dry, clean, and no longer on her. She couldn't remember who she was, didn't know why she stood up, didn't feel her own face. In the mirror across the room stood something that resembled Peppa, but the eyes were hollow, and inside them, silence. Peppa was gone. Only the shell remained, only the mask remained, waiting for a new face, a new game. Since then, some days, along the damp paths near the park, the mask can be seen again, lying neatly, dry, clean, and if anyone picks it up, they may hear a soft whisper from within.
Endless night. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night. She immediately felt that something was wrong. Usually, even at night, her room wasn't completely dark. Street lights outside, the soft glow of the moon, the faint light from her night lamp. But now she was surrounded by absolute darkness. She blinked, trying to adjust to it, but nothing changed. The darkness was thick, like heavy smoke, like a black veil that had covered the entire house. Peppa slowly sat up in bed. A strange unease tightened in her chest. She reached out, found her night lamp, and flicked the switch. The light did not turn on. Peppa frowned. She swung her legs off the bed. The floor was cold, colder than usual. She walked to the window and cautiously pulled back the curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. Outside was endless, bottomless darkness. No moon, no stars, no distant glows from the neighbors' houses. Only black emptiness. Peppa pressed her face against the glass, straining her eyes to see anything. But the longer she looked, the more it seemed like the dark mass outside was moving, like it was alive. A chill crawled up her spine. She turned and ran out of her room. The house was silent, too silent. She called for Mummy Pig, for Daddy Pig, for George. No answer. The door to her parents' bedroom was slightly open. Peppa froze in the hallway. She didn't want to go inside, but she had to. Taking a shaky breath, she pushed the door open. The beds were empty. The blankets were neatly tucked in, as if they had never been used. Peppa took a step back. This was not her house. It couldn't be. She ran downstairs to the front door. She grabbed the handle and pulled. Locked. She rushed to the living room window and pressed her face to the glass. The town was motionless. The streets were swallowed in thick blackness. The houses stood as silent shadows. Usually there would be lights in the windows, but now not a single house was glowing. Not a single sound. No footsteps, no distant hum of cars, no rustling wind. Only silence. Peppa stepped outside. The cold air pricked her skin. She walked down the road, glancing around. No one. She reached the town square where her friends usually played, but where the town should have been, there was now a vast, endless void. The ground abruptly ended, like the town had been erased, leaving only this black abyss behind. Peppa stepped back, her heart pounding, and then in the silence a sound echoed, a slow, heavy footstep. Peppa turned around. A figure stood in the middle of the empty street, tall, motionless, faceless, blending into the darkness. The figure did not move, but Peppa felt its gaze on her. She took a step back. The figure came closer. It didn't walk, it just was suddenly nearer. A deep fear settled in her chest. She turned and ran. But with every step, the road beneath her feet disappeared. The houses melted into the void. The town was vanishing, as if it had never existed. Peppa screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She fell to her knees, looking around frantically. Nothing. Only emptiness. And then, breathing. Software. Cold. Right behind her. A whisper. Someone said her name. She spun around. The darkness collapsed. And then, nothing. The next morning, the town was gone. Not a single soul remained. Only endless night, and someone standing at its center. Someone who remembered how things used to be. But now, everything belonged to the darkness.
Peppa Pig Red Sky. One morning, Peppa woke up without knowing what had disturbed her. The alarm hadn't rung. No one had called her, but something felt wrong. She sat up in bed. Her room was flooded with light, but it wasn't warm or golden. It was dark red, heavy, like the glow of a lamp hidden behind thick fabric, as if the entire world beyond the window had changed. Peppa walked toward the curtain, reached out, but stopped. On the floor just in front of the window lay a crumpled note, its corners bent, the paper creased as if someone had thrown it long ago and it had been waiting ever since, scrawled in uneven handwriting, "Don't look out the window," written hastily, the letters trembling. Peppa turned around. Everything in the room was as usual, same toys, same bedspread, but it all seemed just a little darker, as if the world had been shifted half a step to the side. She stepped into the hallway. The walls looked grayish. The air smelled like dust. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy were sitting at the table, silent. Daddy held a newspaper but wasn't reading. Mummy stared into her cup as if looking down a deep well. "Good morning," Peppa said. No answer. "What's wrong with the sky? Why is everything so red?" Mummy lifted her head, slowly. Her smile was almost normal, but her eyes didn't move, as if she had forgotten how. "And where's George?" Still silence. A slight creak from Daddy's chair. He didn't move. Peppa ran upstairs. George's bed was perfectly made, pillow smoothed, blanket tucked. On the sheet, another note. He looked. Just 2 words. But she understood. The bedroom window was sealed from the inside, dark grey tape, crisscrossed. Behind the glass, the red light pressed in. Thick and still, like a fog inside a windowless room. It didn't flicker, it didn't move. It just existed, and it felt alive. Peppa peeked into the hallway again. The red light had grown stronger, but gave off no warmth. It didn't illuminate, it swallowed whatever it touched. She went back to the kitchen. Her parents were frozen. Mummy's spoon trembled at the edge of her cup, but her hand was locked in place. "Why aren't you talking?" Peppa asked. No reply. On the far wall, a crack appeared, barely visible at first, then slowly growing, as if something behind the wall was scratching from the inside, deliberate, steady. A faint hiss spread across the floorboards. That evening, the house fell deeper into silence. Even the clocks had stopped. Mummy didn't blink. Daddy didn't breathe, yet his chest continued to rise and fall, like someone pretending to be alive. Peppa sat in her room. On the floor, a new note. "Don't open your eyes." She squeezed them shut, tight, but still she could see the red glow through her eyelids. Footsteps, soft hooves, moving slowly through the hallway. Carefully, they stopped at her door. "Peppa," whispered a voice, childlike, a little like George's, but hollow inside. "You want to look, don't you?" She kept her eyes closed. The next morning never came. The light remained the same. Red, constant. No Mummy, no Daddy, no George. The house was empty. Only the faint rustling in the corners and the echo of her own footsteps remained. On the kitchen table sat one final note. "Now you're alone. Don't look up. Ever." She lasted one day, then another. Then she lost track. One day, Peppa stood up, walked to the window, slowly peeled off the tape, strip by strip. Behind the glass, not a street, not the sky, something red, vast, shapeless, and within it, an eye, enormous, alive, unlike anything she'd ever seen. It stared straight at her, and Peppa couldn't look away. The eye was too close, too bright, too correct. She's no longer visible in the house, but if you stand quietly in front of the window long enough, you might catch a reflection, small, childlike, with eyes wide open, eyes that never blink again.
This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig, The Strange Guest. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family home. Peppa and George were playing in their room, while Mummy and Daddy Pig were in the kitchen preparing dinner. The wind howled outside and the rain tapped on the roof, giving the house a cozy, safe feeling. But suddenly, a strange silence settled over the house. Peppa stopped and listened. The room felt a little unsettling. She walked over to the window but saw nothing unusual. However, her gaze lingered on a small shadow near the door. The shadow was unnaturally long, as if someone had left it behind, but no one had entered the room. Peppa decided to go ask her parents, but when she approached the hallway, she noticed that the front door, which usually was tightly closed and locked, was slightly ajar, as if someone had just come inside. She looked towards the staircase. Something caught her eye. On the stairs stood an unknown figure, barely visible in the dark. At first, she thought it might be Daddy Pig, but the figure was too tall and too thin. And the figure wasn't moving. It stood completely still, staring straight at her. Peppa felt a strange unease. She backed away, but her eyes kept following the figure on the stairs. Gradually, it began to move closer, but its movements were not human. They were too smooth, as if something not quite alive. Soon, the figure was right in front of Peppa. It was completely black, with no discernible features. Only pale eyes glowed in the darkness, cold and eerie. Peppa froze, not knowing what to do when the figure took a step forward. Peppa jumped, ran to the door, and screamed. She couldn't understand why she hadn't heard any footsteps from this entity, as it stood right in front of her. But as soon as she turned around, the figure vanished like a shadow in the night. Mummy and Daddy Pig rushed into the hallway. Peppa tried to explain what she had seen, but when they entered, there was nothing unusual in the room or the hallway. The door was, as usual, closed, and once again, a complete silence had settled over the house. The next morning, the door was shut, and there was no sign of the strange guest. But Peppa couldn't forget its eyes. Peppa Pig, the door to darkness. The day was gloomy and quiet. The wind rustled the trees outside, and the sky was covered with thick gray clouds. Peppa and George were playing in their room, building a tall tower out of blocks. The house felt especially cozy until it started to get dark. When Mummy Pig called them for dinner, Peppa stood up and accidentally knocked over the tower, sending the blocks tumbling to the floor. George whined in frustration, but Peppa wasn't paying attention anymore. She was staring at the corner of the room. There, where there had always been just a wall, now stood a door that had never been there before. It was tall, old, with a black handle. It looked out of place, as if it didn't belong in their house. Maybe Mummy and Daddy built a new storage closet, Peppa thought. But the idea sent a strange chill down her spine. George, forgetting about the fallen tower, also noticed the door and pressed himself against Peppa. Peppa took a step forward. The door was closed, but a cold draft seeped from the gap beneath it. She slowly reached out and touched the handle. It was freezing. And then the door creaked open slightly. Just a tiny bit, but it was enough. From the darkness inside came a soft rustling sound. Peppa and George froze, listening. No light, no voices. Just a faint scratching noise, like something in the shadows was dragging its claws across the floor. Peppa quickly pulled her hoof away. George gripped her dress tightly. And then the door started opening wider. Creak! The darkness behind it was too deep, unnatural, swallowing up all the light. Peppa instinctively stepped back. Then it appeared. Out of the blackness, a hoof slid into view. It looked like hers, but too long, with thin fingers instead of rounded edges. Then a second hoof emerged, and then a face peeked out. It was exactly like Peppa's, but its eyes were pitch black, empty, and its mouth, the mouth slowly stretched into an unnatural, wide grin. Peppa screamed and grabbed George's hoof. She bolted toward the hallway door, but then the light flickered. For a split second, everything was swallowed by total darkness, and when the light returned, the door was gone. All that remained was a blank wall, as if it had never existed. George whimpered, clutching Peppa's arm. She breathed heavily, eyes fixed on the spot where the door had been. Everything looked normal, but Peppa knew one thing for certain. It was still here, somewhere, watching.